Over the course of WoW, hunters have had 6 traps in total, plus an ability that only worked with traps. The 4 original traps were Immolation Trap, which would put a fire dot on whoever activated it, Explosive Trap, which would explode on detonation doing crappy AoE damage, Frost Trap, later renamed to Ice Trap, which put ice on the floor and slowed movement speed, and Freezing Trap, which would freeze a target in a block of ice for a long time. In the Burning Crusade, Snake Trap was added, and in Wrath of the Lich King, Freezing Arrow was introduced as an early version of the Trap Launcher for one spell. Then in Cataclysm, Trap Launcher was introduced and Freezing Arrow was removed. Now that I've given you a brief little overview of what all the traps are, I will talk about the traps as a whole for a little bit before going into the changes and uses of all the individual traps in detail. Traps in vanilla worked a little different than they do today. For starters, they couldn't be placed in combat. Traps were supposed to fill the fantasy behind the hunter expertly laying a trap and tricking his target to activate it, which would have been cool and seems like a neat concept on paper. But in practice, Blizzard gave the hunter's trap their only reliable CC, and it was just clunky to use when compared to like a mage's polymorph. For a hunter to freeze trap something in vanilla, they'd essentially have to put the trap out of the way of everyone else, then wait for the pull, or be the one to initiate the pull pack of mobs, and basically have a mob chase them to their trap with Distracting Shot. While a mage could just sit back and cast Polymorph, or a warlock could just sit back and cast Banish, or a druid could just sit back and cast Roots. You see where I'm going with this? Hunters had to go through hoops to do what other classes could do with a simple cast. But don't get me wrong, Freeze Trap was still pretty damn good. All those other spells I mentioned had target restrictions, while Freezing Trap could be used on pretty much anything that didn't resist the spell, which happened pretty frequently back then. Now, what of the other traps? Well, they all kinda sucked. Immolation and Explosive Trap did shit for damage, and why use Ice Trap when you could just use a Freezing Trap? I should also take this time to mention that you could only use one trap at a time until Wrath, as using one would cause the others to go on cooldown. So while the class fantasy of setting the perfect trap and luring your opponent into them sounded cool, the traps themselves were kind of underwhelming. Now let's talk about combat trapping. Back in vanilla, only skilled hunters, or non-brain-dead hunters, could manage to set traps mid-combat, a skill essential to PvP. Hunters, luckily, had this neat ability on a cooldown very similar to the traps, which could take them out of combat instantly, and then lay a trap in combat, and then lay a trap while they were out of combat temporarily. Brilliant! Need to lay an ice trap to kite a rogue in a circle? Well, now you can with expert combat trapping. Sounds simple enough, right? Use feign death, lay a trap, GG. But then you have to remember that hunters had pets that could keep you in combat, so you had to make your pet not attack or dismiss it. And that's where the skill in vanilla combat trapping came in, whether or not you could control your pet. Obviously not the hardest thing to do in the world, but some people just never bothered with it and didn't use traps in combat. Then in the Burning Crusade, traps were changed to be usable in combat only with a 2-second arming timer. What this simply meant was that the trap wouldn't work until it had been out for at least 2 seconds. In Wrath, the arming timer was lowered to 1 second, and traps weren't made to activate instantly again until Warlords. And in Wrath of the Lich King, traps were given separate cooldowns based on their schools of magic. So Frost and Ice Trap were on the Frost school, Immolation and Explosive were in the Fire school, and Snake Traps were in Nature. So you could have up to 3 traps active at a time. They also added the survival ability Black Arrow in the Fire Trap school, even though it did shadow damage because of a proc that the Fire Traps and Black Arrow could proc, which I'll go into more detail when I talk about Explosive Trap later. Now that the general, non-specific details of traps are out of the way, let's talk about each trap in detail. First off, we'll talk about the universally most useful trap during each expansion, Freezing Trap. Freezing Trap has pretty much worked the same way since its inception till how it works now. Freezes a target in a block of ice from anywhere between 30 seconds to 2 minutes. It was a pretty good CC even when you had to Distracting Shot a target over the trap because it was one of the few CCs in the game with no target restrictions. In late Burning Crusade, the target limit to Freezing Trap was removed, which meant you could have multiple targets frozen by a single hunter. And with the right survival talents, the trap could last longer than a minute. This, however, was very situationally useful. One situation this was useful was on the beauty fight in Cataclysm. This dungeon boss had 3 little pup core hounds that hit just as hard as the main boss and needed to be CC, as killing any of them would cause the mommy dog to go into a rage and basically be a wipe. Hunters were the only class in the game that could CC all 3 dogs in the fight by themselves. First, they'd simply launch a freezing trap at one, then wait 30 seconds, then launch a second freezing trap at the second one, and use Scare Beast on the third. Then during the fight, the hunter would just have to re-trap the 2 pups as it came off cooldown, and just re-fear the third whenever it ended. Ice Trap, which used to be called Frost Trap, was always pretty good on fights that required kiting a lot of mobs at once, like the worms in the Magma fight. The trap works pretty much the same as it always has, put out a little frost patch in the floor and slows everyone in it. There were always some gimmicky mechanics that gave you a little more crit on targets that were affected by the trap, but nothing too major. For survival hunters, the trap has always been a little better. For starters, when it was triggered, it could root everyone hit by it initially for 4 seconds, which was pretty long for a root that doesn't break on damage. Also, Ice Trap could proc lock and load instantly, which gave you 2 free explosive shots with no cooldown, which I'll just tell you was a really good damage proc. If survival hunters could get the trap to proc on adds and boss fights, since the trap wouldn't trigger against bosses, and they didn't have to go out of their way to use it, it could actually be a nice little damage boost. Immolation Trap was a pretty mediocre dot. If you were trying to solo an elite mob and could place a trap before combat and get them to run over it, then it was some nice extra damage. But outside of solo mob fights, it wasn't as useful considering it shared its cooldown with other more useful traps. It did have a glyph at one point that turned it into a bursty dot. What it did was take 6 seconds off its total duration, so from 15 seconds to 9 seconds, and the dot did 100% more damage, which turned out to be about 20% more total damage on the trap overall. Again, it didn't make the trap especially good or anything, but I always found it to be a fun glyph to use while soloing. Immolation Trap was removed in Mists of Pandaria. Explosive Trap seemed like it would have been a lot more useful vanilla than it really was. I mean, it was an AoE, and as for AoEs, its damage was pretty low, but an AoE is an AoE. The only problem was actually using it. Most hunters didn't want to run into melee range of a pack of mobs to feign death and drop Explosive Trap, when it wasn't really worth it. There's also the fact that it'd most likely be on cooldown, since in most situations when you'd use Explosive Trap, you'd also probably use Freezing Trap to CC something. And to top it all off, for the longest time, 2 Explosive Traps in the same area didn't stack. It's crazy to think that an AoE wouldn't work with another version of itself. In Wrath, Explosive Trap got a glyph that gave its periodic damage a chance to crit, which was revolutionary. Before Cataclysm, AoE ticks and dots did not crit, nor did they tick fast with haste. They basically only scaled with damage, and only special dots and AoEs could crit with things like set bonuses and glyphs. And Explosive Trap was one of them. It wasn't worth using though. Explosive Trap's periodic ticks did tiny amounts of damage, and them critting ever so often wasn't going to help. But Explosive Trap did do another thing that was pretty unique. You see, Explosive Trap did its damage every 2 seconds over 20 seconds. Most normal dots did their damage every 3 seconds. For a short time in the beginning of Dragon Soul and Cataclysm, it was actually a DPS increase to simply launch Explosive Trap at the boss for a single target damage, rather than use Black Arrow, Survival's go-to dot, which shared a cooldown with the 2 other fire traps. Black Arrow did a ton more damage, but it was a pretty standard dot. It ticked every 3 seconds for 15 seconds, for a total of 5 ticks of damage over the course of its cooldown. Explosive Trap ticked every 2 seconds over 20 seconds for 10 ticks of the dot over the course of its cooldown, which meant Explosive Trap ticked twice as much as Black Arrow. And at the time, Lock and Load, Survival's most sought after proc, has the same chance to proc off of ticks of Black Arrow as it did with Explosive Trap. So because Explosive Trap could tick more often and ticked 2 times more than Black Arrow, it gave more procs of Lock and Load, which in turn increased their DPS more than if they used the higher damage dot of Black Arrow. And if there were adds in the fight, oh boy, you were looking at Lock and Load City. But you see, Blizzard didn't want hunters having to launch Explosive Trap on single target boss fights over using Black Arrow. So instead of nerfing Explosive Trap, they instead just changed Black Arrow to basically do the same thing. It would do its damage every 2 seconds over 20 seconds, just like Explosive Trap. And Black Arrow still works that way to this day. And it's all thanks to Explosive Trap being better than it for a little while in Dragon Soul. But that wasn't the only time the Explosive Trap was extremely useful. In Mist, Explosive Trap got a glyph, which gave it the ability to knock back everyone around the point of the trap trigger instead of doing damage, giving PvP hunters a ton more utility, as previously the only way to knock back someone was with Power Shot or a Rhino Pet, both of which were kind of clunky and hard to use. But with the glyph, now all 3 specs got access to a very easy to use knockback, which is still a staple of PvP hunters to this day as of making this video. It'll probably go away in Legion when they remove glyphs, I don't know. I haven't really looked into it, honestly. Snake Trap, added in the Burning Crusade, was a weird thing. What it did was summon a bunch of snakes that shot poisons at random shit, with each poison being similar to a rogue poison at the time, slowing targets' movement speed, casting speed, and putting up a stacking damage dot. It didn't really do very much damage. Both Explosive Trap and Immolation Trap did more. Also, Ice Trap was a better AoE slow. So why use it at all in the Burning Crusade when all the traps still shared a cooldown? Well, it was pretty useful on a few very specific occasions. Like in the Alar fight in Tempest Keep, the Phoenix would occasionally throw out meteors which needed to be stuck by multiple players to split its damage. A hunter could just throw down a snake trap and split the damage with the multitude of low health snakes, trivializing a major mechanic of the fight. And in PvP, if you were trying to mana drain a healer with Viper Sting, which had a 15-second cooldown and could be dispelled pretty easily, you'd want to hit the healer with a snake trap first to give your Viper Sting some dispel protection, as the snakes would just spam the hell out of their poison and could put up to a max of 7 poisons at a time. 5 poisons on the stacking dot, 1 for the crippling poison and 1 for the mind-numbing poison. And if the healer dispelled any of these, the snakes would just reapply them almost instantly. In Wrath, Snake Trap was made a little bit more useful when traps were given separate cooldowns based on their type of damage. Snake Trap was the only hunter trap that didn't share cooldown with another spell, so they could use it as much as they wanted to. And since Snake Trap could proc a 4-second root that didn't break on damage if you were survival, it did see some use in PvP if you were a survival hunter. Plus, Viper Sting was still around, so it could still be used to protect the Viper Sting from dispel protection. Snake Trap was turned into a glyph that can replace Ice Trap in Warlords, and was made no longer baseline. So if you want to use a trap to slow while still being able to use Freezing Trap for a CC, I guess you could take it over Ice Trap. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Snake Trap bug before I go into the next trap. In the Burning Crusade, snakes from Snake Trap could attack other players even if they weren't flagged for PvP. And when they attacked, would flag the player for PvP, allowing hunters to just activate the Snake Trap next to a mob and kill low-level players in PvE servers. And this bug was in the game for a few patches before Blizzard fixed it. And finally, we'll talk about Freezing Arrow. Freezing Arrow was an early version of Trap Launcher that only worked on one trap, Freezing Trap. The arrow shared a cooldown with other frost traps and allowed you to basically just launch Freezing Trap up to 40 yards away. This new mechanic of launching a trap gave rise to the popular hunter PvP combo called Scatter Trapping. What Scatter Trapping did was use the hunter's ability Scatter Shot, which caused the target to wander back and forth for 4 seconds, and then launch the trap at their feet, which could then activate and freeze them for another 10 seconds. What made this combo so good compared to other classes with CC was that this was all instant. Scatter Shot was instant, Freezing Arrow was instant, there was no playing around it or interrupting it. With other CCs like Polymorph, Cyclone, or Fear, they'd have to get the cast off for it to take effect, which you can either interrupt or run behind a pillar before the cast finished so it would cancel. With a hunter, all you could do was either eat the trap for your healer or throw out a CC on the hunter the instant they used Scatter Shot to prevent the follow-up trap, which is a lot harder to pull off than using a counter spell or pillar humping. Freezing Arrow allowed hunters to have up to 14 seconds of CC with no casting, making them some of the best CC'ers in PvP. It's pretty crazy what one new ability can do for a class. In Cataclysm, Freezing Arrow was removed, and hunters were given Trap Launcher. Trap Launcher in its first form was garbage. At first it seemed cool, having the ability to launch all your traps rather than just Freezing Trap, but the launcher was very clunky to use. You see, in its first form, Trap Launcher was a buff you had to cast which cost about 20 focus. At the beginning of Cataclysm, hunters were given focus instead of mana, and hunters had terrible focus problems pretty much all throughout Cataclysm. You know how Steady and Cobra Shot give you 14 focus for every cast today? Well, in Cataclysm they only gave 9 focus each. It was the Dragon Soul 2 set bonus that increased the focus generation by those 2 shots to around 14, and Blizzard thought, Hey, you know what? Hunters are actually not constantly focus starred with this 2-set bonus. Let's make it baseline. And that's how hunter focus problems more or less went away. To go off on a little tangent here, isn't it great when a cool and convenient set bonus gets made baseline? It doesn't happen often, but it has happened a few times in WoW. Maybe I'll make a video about it at some point in the future. Anyways, back to Trap Launcher. You see, you had to cast the ability first, which would give you a little buff that would make your next trap launch instead of being laid at your feet. And Trap Launcher didn't activate the global cooldown, per se, but also couldn't be used at the same time as another spell, so you essentially had to press 2 buttons to launch a trap instead of being able to macro Trap Launcher into the trap itself. So to scatter trap, you first had to use Trap Launcher, then scatter shot, then launch the trap. What used to be a quick 2-button 14-second CC turned into a 3-button rotation. And because of this little change, it was easier to stop. If the enemy team saw the hunter all of a sudden got the Trap Launcher buff on them, they could immediately CC the hunter before he had a chance to get off the freezing trap, or make plans to have someone else soak it. The new Trap Launcher was basically like a warning sign to the enemy team that the hunter was about to CC. And while hunters could still CC effectively in PvP, it wasn't as good as it had been. Plus, the focus cost was like throwing salt into the wounds. Like I said a little earlier, hunters had major focus problems, and spending 20 focus to trap was worth about 2 steady shots of focus regeneration. And this was back when hunters still had Aspect of the Fox, and had to stance to be able to use steady and Cobra Shot while moving, and hunters were just made a lot more complicated for no good reason. In Myths, Blizzard just removed the focus cost and made Trap Launcher last forever, making scatter trapping almost as good as it once was. Almost, because by this time Blizzard had nerfed CC across the board, and Freezing Trap only lasted 8 seconds in PvP. And I think they made Scatter Shot share a cooldown with Freezing Trap, or maybe Scatter Shot was removed in Myths. Whatever, that's not important. What matters was they changed Trap Launcher from a clunky, annoying ability to use into a pretty good one, like how it probably should have been in the beginning. Alright, and I think that's it. The very first History of WoW Abilities video I made on this channel back in 2013 was the history of hunter traps. While the information in the video was about 90% correct, the way I delivered the info wasn't all that great. Plus the audio quality was absolute shit, and it's not up to par with the quality I can put out today. And that's why I remade the video. I'll be remaking my old videos from when I used a shitty mic, and even some after when I didn't use my fake voice. I think the visual portions of the older videos are fine actually. I think the shitty drawings I use for a lot of them adds a little charm to the video. But those drawings take so much longer to make than just getting footage in games. I don't really do that anymore.